Hi everybody, here we are for the lecture for vascular plants, and this is appropriate. You can see I'm in the forest. So you're gonna have to look through the leaves to see me, but that's okay. I'm not the important part. The information on here is the important part. So I'm going to split this lecture, I believe, into 3 parts. So this first part of the lecture will cover the first 3 leaves on the right side here. We're going to go over the plant relationships by adaptation. We'll look at what are vascular plants, and then we'll get into what are seedless vascular plants. Okay, so here we go. So here's just a little bit of review from the non-vascular plants that we studied. So remember that for non-vascular plants, they don't have any internal pipelines to conduct water and other solutes, other materials through the plant body, right? And then remember that, so that therefore they have to remain very small. And that's what you see on this table here with the bryophytes all the way over to the left side. They have to remain very, very small, and they get their water and other materials basically through diffusion and osmosis. So their tissues are also very thin to be able to do that as well. Remember that the gamete producing stage is the dominant part of their life cycle. So hopefully you remember whether that's haploid or diploid. I'll tell you right now, it's haploid. That's the dominant part of their life cycle. So remember that with haploid, well, I'll explain haploid in a minute. We've got another picture coming up. But now if you move over to the right on this picture, you'll see the vascular plants. And here in this picture, it's indicated by the ferns. And then also the seed plants, they're showing a conifer here. And what we're seeing now is that the sporophyte phase is becoming more dominant, right? And other things to look at is just look at the plant body. They're becoming much larger and also branched, so they're becoming much more complex. Again, the sporophyte is becoming independent and dominant. There's multiple growth tips, which again is going to allow it to grow in many different directions. If you remember the mosses, they basically had that one plant body kind of projecting upward. They will also see that there's multiple sporangia being produced, and if you recall, those are the organs where spores are produced. And we'll see that spores don't go away. They are still used for dispersal. Okay? But as we get into the seed plants, they're going to become much more complex as well. Okay? So let's look at kind of these evolutionary trends that we've seen. So here you can see that the evolutionary trend of plants is that over time, the gametophyte stage becomes less important while the sporophyte stage is becoming more important. And of course, both stages are important. So the term importance is really referring to its contribution to the overall life cycle, how long it's staying in that life cycle, and if one is dependent on the other. So remember that, so you can see here kind of the yellow portion of this picture. It's getting, the gametophyte importance is getting smaller and smaller. It's the gametophyte stage is trending downward. It's becoming reduced over time, and the sporophyte stage is actually becoming the main portion of the life cycle. Okay, so again, I started to mention this before. The gametophyte stage is haploid throughout. Okay, and one of the things to remember is that haploid means that each individual only carries one copy of each gene. So those that the major dominant portion of their life cycle, if they're only carrying one copy of each gene, that does better in a more stable environment. Okay, and water is a more stable environment. Just kind of think now, if you watch the weather reports, you'll see on a day-to-day basis, on dry land, our air temperature really varies quite greatly. It might be 80 degrees one day, 90 degrees the next day. It could be 70 degrees, right? And So we see that in the air, but if you pay attention to the ocean temperatures, it's usually like right now between 65 and 70. And not even that's a pretty big range. It's usually in a specific area, stays about 65 right now. And then as the seasons change, the cold waters may come in and it stays pretty stable over time. So they're not getting these big fluctuations. And so, therefore, that means the genes don't need to adapt as readily to a changing environment. You can do that better with a diploid set of genes. Okay, so when we're seeing this trend of the gametophyte quote unquote importance decreasing, that's because these plants now are adapting more to dry land and they do better with the diploid stage, having two copies of the gene. And then, therefore, there can be more changes due to meiosis, due to mutations and recombination of genes. And so that helps to provide the better adaptation. Okay, and this will be a theme throughout the semester, so we'll even see this with animalia as well. All right, so just recall that mosses were the first to move onto land, and they retain the gametophyte dominance from the green algae who started in the ocean and stay in the ocean. So therefore, the mosses need that moist environment. But again, then we start to see this trend toward adaptations toward dry land. Okay, and I want to put in the phylogenetic tree in here. Again, you're not responsible for phylogenetic trees yet. I'll let you see me. And we're going to cover that at the end of the semester. But I do want you to start looking at them so you get familiar with them. And this tree just kind of shows you the relationship of plants through evolutionary time. Starting at the bottom, the charophytes are the most ancient living relative between the algae and what became plants, right? And then as you go up through the tree, you start to see more complexity because the organisms are acquiring traits that are helping them to adapt to the drier conditions. So another way to read this is you kind of see everything is got circles around it. So the largest circle encompasses all of the groups, all of the organisms within there. That means that once we label these with traits, that means all of those organisms share the traits kind of within that yellowish color. Then if you move up to the next circle, right there, the hornworts, liverworts, and mosses, these are, now we're seeing land plants. And so they develop traits that the charophytes do not have, right? And so they develop traits, and then these traits are also shared by the rest going up. Then we get to lycophytes, vascular plants, same deal. They develop traits that the land plants and the charophytes don't have, and so on and so forth. So the traits are getting more specific, and we're getting less and less organisms as we go up. All right, by the time we get to the end of the semester, you're going to become experts in that. Okay, so that takes us to vascular plants. We had learned about the non-vascular plants. And so the thing about vascular plants is now we see vascular tissues. These are tissues that are allowing water to be conducted through the plant tissues themselves, through the plant itself, and also organic solutes. So the food that the plant makes for itself can also be conducted and distributed throughout the plant body and stored down at the roots. Okay, and so what happened though is that these cells that can conduct water, those are the tracheids. And if you remember from a previous lecture, the tracheids then became lignified. So there was lignin inside of there that is allowing the tracheids to have some structure, some solid structure to them. And so that allows the plant tissue now to be more rigid and to be able to grow up taller. Okay, and then of course those tracheids conduct water from the roots all the way to the top of the plant. And so here I have a picture. This is when I went to Costa Rica back in 2012. I made a return trip there with my husband, and this is in the forest. You can see how tall the trees are. And so again, without the vascular tissues, they would not be able to grow that tall. But also right in the middle, that with the kind of the curled structures at the top, that's a fern. And we're going to look at ferns a little bit later. It's huge. That thing is taller than me. So it was kind of different. We see ferns around here as being these small kind of house plants. But down in Costa Rica in the rainforest, in other countries down there, they can be quite large. It's pretty cool. We also see, again, because of this vascular tissue and the lignified tracheids, we start to see true stems and roots as well. Okay. The other thing we see are leaves. Leaves are really important adaptation. And so these are part of the vascular tissue. They display what we call determinate growth. This has to do with tissues differentiating. So what this means is that there will be some tissue growing along the stem that the genes will turn on. That means that they will form the leaf structure. So that's determinate growth. We also will start to see bilateral symmetry. So that means there's a definite left and right side of leaf structures. Okay, there's a definite arrangement on the stem, and that's in some ways we can use that arrangement in order to identify specific species. Okay. And then the true leaves, meaning a structure that actually functions as a leaf, can be divided into what we call microphyls or megaphyls. So from the term microphyll, that's much smaller. They're small and they really just have a single vascular strand. So that means vascular tissue, the tracheids just run right down, usually down the middle. Okay. It's probably evolved from a small projection from the stem itself. So the stem just got a little projection and then began to branch off and form the small leaf. Again, it's just a small kind of rounded projection that comes off. And really, we'll see an example later, only club mosses have microphylls. The rest of our vascular plants have megaphylls. These are also known as true leaves. Even though they're all true leaves, sometimes we use the word euphyll. EU in front of a word in biology usually means true. Okay, so this is the flattened leaf that we think of. So megaphylls evolved from stem branches, and that's what you really see in this picture here. The stems branching out, some of them began to flatten, and with that flattening, webbing began to fill in between the branches with photosynthetic material between those branches. And that's then what the leaf formed. And you can see within those branches, those are now the veins inside of there, or the vascular tissue. So instead of a simple strand of vascular tissue, you get this branching pattern. So you can see that more surface area of the leaf itself can obtain water. And also, as each of those areas on the leaf are creating sugars through photosynthesis, the leaf now is the photosynthesizing organ. It can take the sugars from those areas and distribute it down to the rest of the plant. So think about this formation of a true leaf of the megaphyll from an evolutionary point of view, because one of the other things that leaves need to do when they're performing photosynthesis is they take carbon dioxide from the air. And so these little pores, we're going to look at leaves more closely in another lecture, but on the undersurface of the leaf, there are these little pores called stomata. They're little holes in which CO2 can enter. Okay, and so the leaves actually began to evolve during a time in Earth's history when carbon dioxide levels were declining. And so developing a flattened blade allowed for the leaf to have more gas exchange because it was more surface area to insert more of these stomata. Okay, again, we'll study stomata later, but just realize right now they're little pores, little holes on the underside of the leaf. And the more there are, the more CO2 can come in. And the more CO2, then the more photosynthesis can occur. All righty. Now we kind of understand the basics of what vascular plants are. So let's look at our first group of vascular plants, and these are plants that don't produce seeds. So these are the seedless vascular plants. They're going to still use spores as a main way of reproducing. So there's two main clades of vascular plants, two major groupings is what a clade means. And that's our club mosses and our ferns. Okay, so I've got some pictures of club mosses there and the ferns. Oh, I gotta move my little plant over. So ferns are at the bottom there. Okay, but let's look at club mosses first. So there's about 1,200 species in existence today. If the species is alive today, we say it's extant, E-X-T-A-N-T, an extant species. So club mosses are also, that's a general name for it. They're also known as ground pines. But as happens a lot with organisms, any type of organism, many times the common name just adds to the confusion for its classification. Because these organisms, these plants, they're not mosses and they're not pine trees, right? They're in a group all by itself, but because that they have some similarities between those two plants, just in general, the common name kind of develops that way. That's why we have scientific names though. So there I put under club mosses Lycopodium. So Lycopodium is the genus name for these groups. So again, we're going to get more and more involved with scientific names toward the end of the semester. But again, I'm going to start introducing them so that you're become more familiar with them as we go through the semester. You're not responsible to remember scientific names now, but by the end of the semester, you will. You'll start to use them more and more, and it'll be easier for you to use them. Okay, there was a time where club mosses were large and tree-like, and so that was during the Carboniferous age, and that's an age where when all of those plants died off, they sunk into the ground and they created what is today our coal deposits. Okay, so we're kind of still dependent on them today. Today, you can see they're very much reduced size and they're more common in the temperate woodlands, right, within that biome. So they are a vascularized plant. We do see true roots. So roots, again, are going to be able to draw nutrients from the soil, which is going to benefit the plant much more. They still produce a rhizome, like we saw with the mosses. A rhizome is simply almost like an underground stem to which the plants can branch off of and grow off of there. So I had mentioned that this is the only group where we have an example of microphyls. So very small scale-like leaves that you can see at the end there. And then also at that strobilus at the end, it has a sporangia, and recall that sporangia are the organs that make spores. So this is a spore producing plant. Those are the reproductive portions. All right, the more familiar group are the ferns, the pteridophytes. Again, don't worry about the scientific name. If you remember it, great, but I'm not going to require you to remember it at this point. So it's a pteridophyte. You don't pronounce the P, just pronounce the T. And these are groups of plants referred to as ferns, horsetails. There's a fern, horsetails, and whisk ferns, right? So here I'll zoom in of what horsetails look like. A little bit more simple in structure than the ferns. Okay, and then here I'll, same with the whisk ferns, actually a pretty simple structure there. You can really see where the sporangia develop. Okay. I think the ferns are what we're more familiar with. All of them share these characteristics, similar characteristics: a rhizome, fronds, true roots, sori, and then also a prothallus. And so we're going to look at that one right here. And we'll use, since ferns are more familiar to us, we'll use the fern as the example for all of these groups. Okay. And so here you see the fern sporophyte. So we're going to look at the life cycle in a minute. The sporophyte is going to be the larger portion of the plant, and it's actually going to be independent of the gametophyte. Okay, so the sporophyte portion of the plant, you can see that there are roots, again, true roots, and a rhizome. I'll zoom in on that for you there. And then branching off the roots, what you're seeing, the frond is what is producing the leaf of the fern. And so it consists of the stem-like structure called the petiole. And then the blade, you can see that the leaves, the whole thing is one leaf, but the leaf then is kind of divided into these structures that alternate. On the underside of the frond, on the backside of the blade along there, will be sori. And sori are these little dots on the back side of the frond. Zoom in a little bit for you. All those little dots in there are the sori. And those sori contain the sporangia where the spores are being made. Okay. I remember my mom, as a little kid, my mom had ferns in the house as houseplants, and I remember seeing the little dots on the underside of the leaf, the sori. I didn't know what those were at the time, and I thought my mom's plants were diseased. Little did I know that the fern was just reproducing. Okay, so that's the main portion of the plant that you see through most of its life. It does have a gametophyte. The gametophyte is called a prothallus, and it's on the prothallus where the archegonia and the antheridia are located. So you might have to review the previous lecture if you don't remember what those are. But again, archegonia are the organs that make the eggs, and antheridia are the organs that make the sperm. So we still need egg and sperm produced here. Okay, and so let's put all this together by looking at the alternation of generations. Okay, and so this is a picture from your textbook. So please make sure you study your alternation of generations. It's really important in the plants. It really helps us to understand the evolution of each plant. And what you're going to do is you're going to compare, again, the gametophyte stage with the sporophyte stage. Which one is more dominant, which one is dependent on the other. And then also remember that it's split between cell division type, whether it's meiosis or mitosis. So I did put a learning video on Canvas to give you kind of the basics of what mitosis and meiosis are. Okay, so we can start down in the lower left corner. You see the fronds there of the sporophyte. And so again, on the underside of the leaf, you'll see that the sori, and that's that little inset there, the sori are growing, and that's the cluster of the sporangia. Okay, so the sporangia inside of there, and there's, as the arrow moves up, what's happening is inside of there, cells are dividing by meiosis. So remember, the sporophyte stage is diploid, 2N. So the cells within the sori within the sporangia are dividing by meiosis. Read it there on the slide. You can see, let me go back. You can see on the meiosis right there on the left side. So what that means is those cells inside of the sporangia are dividing to produce the haploid spores. Okay, and then that sporangium, the capsule opens up and the spores get released and they get carried. The wind can carry them, very light microscopic cells. They can carry them, and when they land on the ground, on a suitable ground, then they'll start to germinate. And a suitable ground has to be very moist. So ferns are still dependent on moisture. We see them more in very moist environments. Sometimes you can actually see them in the desert, but it's usually in an area where maybe it's between rocks or within a crack in the rock where water, once it does rain, water tends to accumulate in there and stay for a long time. So there always has to be water around. And the next stages also tell you why, not just for the for the spores to germinate into the prothallus. That's what grows next into that heart-shaped structure. Okay. And remember then on the prothallus, that's the gametophyte itself. And on there are the archegonia and the antheridia developing. So once those develop, the egg stays embedded within the archegonium and the sperm get released. Now the surface of the gametophyte, because it's in a very moist environment, has water on it. So the sperm actually swim through the water on top of the prothallus and make their way to the egg. Okay? And so once the sperm penetrate the egg and the nuclei of both the egg and the sperm fuse, so remember the egg and sperm each have a haploid nucleus, meaning half the number of genes. Once those fuse, that's the action of fertilization, and then they become diploid. Okay, and once they fuse, they are a single cell now, and that's what you see in that arrow pointing downward into the next, back into the diploid side of the cycle. The zygote is the single cell that is diploid now. And it's from the zygote now that will divide by mitosis and produce the sporophyte. You can see that little sporophyte growing there. It grows out of the gametophyte, but it is nutritionally independent of the gametophyte because it's also growing its own root system. Right? So with its own root system, it's gaining water and nutrition from the soil. So the sporophyte and the gametophyte is also independent of the sporophyte. Because again, looking back at the top, you'll notice that there's no sporophyte up there. It's only the gametophyte because the spores got distributed away from the plant, okay, away from the parent plant. So again, now that the roots are developing and the frond now is developing, and what's interesting is that when a frond on a fern develops, again, it forms this kind of curled structure here, and I love the name of these. They're called fiddleheads. So ferns, before the leaf blade kind of unfurls and flattens out, it's the circular structure called a fiddlehead. And this one again is from Costa Rica, and this thing was like 4 feet tall. So again, normally our ferns are quite small, like houseplant size, but not so in the tropical rainforest. You can still see some very large ones. Ferns also used to be in the Carboniferous period, used to be very tall, 6-foot trees, maybe even taller. And they also are from once they died and geological time went by, they are our oil deposits. So they're very important to us today as our fossil fuels. They're called fossil fuels because they are really the fossils of ferns and, as we saw earlier, club mosses. That's where that comes from. Again, it's the Carboniferous age. All right. So that's our alternation of generations for our seedless vascular plants. Make sure you can reproduce, not only just reproduce and memorize, but make sure you can explain the alternation of generations within the fern group. We'll use the fern as the example for the vascular seedless plants. Okay, it's kind of fun looking at you through the leaves here. All right, that then will take us to the seed plants. So I will end this video here because it's been a half hour. I think I'm trying to keep these videos short for you. So in part 2, we'll actually look at the seed plants and and then look at gymnosperms. Depending on how long that goes, I may end the presentation there and do a third video on angiosperms. Okay? Thanks, everybody. See you in a minute.